A few weeks back on Houston 8, while discussing the state of the state, Texas State Senator Dan Patrick spoke of the budget cuts focused on education. We wanted to know more. So we've invited education pundits and activists to join us in a discussion of the current situation of our education system in the state of Texas. What have been the successes? What have been the failures? What will balancing the state budget cost us? And how can we ensure our children are getting the best possible education? Tonight, if in fact the children are our future, how now does the future look? I'm Ernie Manous, and this is Houston 8. Joining us tonight are Dr. Robert Sanborn, President and CEO, Children at Risk; Alan Weeks, Representative for Save Texas Schools; and Andrew Dewey, Executive Vice President of the Houston Federation of Teachers. Before we start, remember you can share your thoughts throughout the show on Twitter using hashtag Houston8. And now welcome to our guests. Let's just start right at the top in all of this. $9.5 billion was originally talked about what was going to need to be cut from the budget. It eventually made its way down, as I understand it, to about $4 billion. We have a budget in the state that is basically out of control, and as if I understand it correctly, about 50% of our budget goes into education in one way or another. Something's got to give. What should legislators be doing then? If cutting is a bad idea, because none of us want to see anything happen to schools, but the money's got to come out of somewhere. How do we handle this situation?
I think you sort of set up a false situation, though, I think, when you talk about this. If we truly want to invest in our future, it means we're talking about public education. Public education has always been the best way to bring children from one economic class to another and produce a citizenry that's going to be vital for the state and for our economic success. But when we set up a situation where we have this budget shortfall, part of it is the management of the state. We need to manage our money, whether that be increasing revenue or figuring out ways to have more tax dollars come in so that we can indeed invest in our future. Because if we sort of sit on this whole idea that we don't have enough money, so we have to cut education, we're basically using poor management to run our state.
Alan, let me ask you this. I'll come to you one second. Yeah. If we're looking at this from somebody who runs their house and you know how much money you have and you know what your bills are and you've got to adjust, is that the right way or the wrong way to look at what the state does?
Well, that's a great way to look at it, and I think that's the way most people look at it. If you've got a budget shortfall in your household budget, you cut back. You don't go to the movies. You don't go out to eat as much, or whatever it is. You cut back to a certain point, but when suddenly you can't pay your rent or your mortgage, you can't do those basics, you can't put the clothes on the kids, then you say, I probably have to go out and get a second job. I've got to get some more revenue coming in here. That's the way any reasonable Texan, I think, would look at it. And those are the choices before our state. We trim in a time of recession, which I think is rational to do. But also, we go out and we look at what revenue we can bring in. And right now, actually, that's what is happening at the local level, because property taxes all over are booming in the next year. Right. So the middle class, the working class folks are going to be paying higher taxes this year because revenue has to support schools, has to come in somehow.
Andy, I cut you off.
That's exactly right. You need to increase revenue where you can. If family is having a budget shortfall and someone's only working 20 hours a week, you need to go out and work more. You need to bring in revenue where revenue can be brought in. And frankly, Texas is not tapping into its potential revenue sources. It's leaving money on the table, it's leaving money out there that can be spent to invest in public education. However, if we look at the premise is that the only way to balance the budget is by cutting spending without tapping other revenue sources, well, then they did what they had to do. They cut the budget, and we're going to see a long-range, long-term detriment to Texas because of that.
If I'm listening closely, I'm hearing our viewers screaming at their TVs, Are they saying more taxes? We're already strapped. And things are out of control and people spend money poorly in government situations, also in education situations. So if you're telling me I've got to give more of my money so more money can be squandered, I'm all for cutting budgets and letting administrators figure out the right way to spend the money they have.
Well, I think, Ernie, your latter part, though, is on target. I think the general public really feels like money has been mismanaged. And when you look at the success levels within public education, there's a lot of questions there, right? When close to half of our kids are never finishing high school, are dropping out of school in our urban areas, that's not a very good indicator of success. So it's very easy when you see basically failure to say, let's cut money. But when you look across the state of Texas and you see what really works within public education, it does cost more money. So I think the demand should be not cut public education, but how do we reform public education to really focus on what really works? Because it gets back to that investment in our children. If we want to be successful in the future, those kids are going to have to be successful. All of our kids are going to have to be successful. But if we continue to cut, we're basically setting ourselves up for failure in the future.
And I think that's what was going on before this session. And that really speaks to me. You know, I was highly involved in the last session, and the conversation was about how to make schools better. Democrats, Republicans, didn't matter. Everybody talked about ways to improve. School reform is the topic. This session, there was almost no talk of school reform, right, of quality in education. It was all about how can we do this on the cheap. It came down to dollars and cents. And we've got to get back to how can we make education better. And sometimes that's simply implementing better, doing things with the dollars we've got better, but sometimes it does cost money.
But a starving person is the worst person to shop in the grocery store because they're not making long-term plans. They're trying to fix the situation before them. And if, in fact, the state is in financial trouble as we understand it to be, then this is something that needs to be taken care of immediately. Is it a wrong thought to fix it this way right now and figure we can repair damage in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years?
Unfortunately, the state of Texas education does not think in the long term. The politicians
the state legislature doesn't think in the long term.
The politicians think until the next election cycle. And in the schools, more and more, we think until the next benchmark test. Can we get our kids past the next test? And then the one after that, and the one after that. It reminds me of my favorite football team, the Houston Texans. They're great at racking up first downs, but they forget to score touchdowns. And this is where we are in Texas. You know,
but do you think our politicians are sitting there saying they don't care about education, they care about the next election?
They care about the short term, whether it's their next election cycle or it's whether the next town meeting they have to go to where they have to justify to their electorate what they are doing. In order to keep doing the good things they are doing, they have to get reelected.
And I think this session is a little different. We really have to think in a little bit. What you just said may apply generally, that a lot of our legislators, they really are thinking about the good of kids in public education. I think a lot of legislators that think like that shut down this time because the political pressures were so great. This was a very unusual session. It was preceded by an unusual election. And so this session became much more about ideology, about politics and posturing. We've got a governor who's considering, not considering, higher office. We've got all these factors swirling around this session. And so I think a lot of people on public education sat back. A good example is, a fine legislator, Senator Ogden. In March, he was saying, as head of the Senate Finance Committee, we need to bring in more revenue. This margins tax that in 2006 we put in and said it would provide X dollars. It hasn't performed. Just like the comptroller at that time said it wouldn't, she was right. It's underperformed, and so we're literally, grossly underfunding our responsibilities. That's what he said in March. By April, he wasn't saying it anymore. He was quiet because he realized this was going nowhere in the politics at the time. So can we have a next session that's less political where we can get back to rational conversation? That's what we need to have. And really that's what Save Texas Schools and others, that's what we're trying to do, is push it back towards being about the kids and not about politics.
Okay, let me jump in here then and say all of this has happened now. Session's over. The rules have come down. The bills have been passed. There is a cut in funding for schools.
Yeah.
Now the problem is here before us. What should schools... Now, first of all, I guess the bigger question is, what does this cutting in funding mean to our local schools? What do the parents that are watching right now, how will they see this being played out?
Depends where they are. Just yesterday, the Equity Center in Austin came out with a report that shows the gross inequality in per pupil funding around between richer districts and poorer districts in Texas. Even if they have roughly the same tax rate, you'll see a huge difference in the number of dollars spent per child. Or if they have roughly the same number of dollars spent per child, you'll see a gross difference in tax rates.
Real quick, before we go any further in that, explain how, because I would have just assumed every student in Texas gets the same amount of money. Who decides how much is going to each student?
It's part of the formula scheme that the legislatures devised when they decided to fund public education. How they do it, it's the weighted average daily attendance, how much per pupil each school district receives from the state, and there's gross inequality in that number across the state between school districts that are generally considered property rich and those that are not.
And the number becomes even more inequitable when you look at how much it costs. You know, a student from a economically disadvantaged situation where you have two working parents, parents aren't there to help them academically in the afternoon, parents have low levels of educational attainment, those kids basically are more expensive within the system because they need more help. And as a state, we need to be giving them more help if we want them to get to that level that we expect them to be. And so it becomes even more inequitable. And so what the result of that is going to be is that we're going to see those children get less attention. We're going to see dropout rates increase. I think it's one of the key things that we fail to understand is that all those kids that have been on the borderline, and we have seen dropout rates slightly decrease over the last couple of years. But I think they're going to go right back up, and that means fewer kids that are out there in society that are producing for our state, more children that become adults that are a burden on the state.
And you know, there's a bit of a perfect storm going on with the federal funding also. And by the way, I think people confuse the federal deficit with the state situation. We have a balanced budget situation, and we really can get things under control pretty quickly on the state level. I mean, that's very different from the federal. But the federal funding is shrinking quickly, and a lot of these same kids, Texas has, again, tried to do education on the cheap and depend on federal funding despite what people might think. I know in 2009, the latest figures, Texas was number 3 in the amount we got from the federal government for schools. So a lot of the low-income kids, English language learners, others, we've depended on that money, and that money's going away. So they're really going to be hit hard, you know, especially in low-income districts.
And I think for the average taxpayer, you know, I think what they're hearing is that they have felt that our schools have not been managed well. They have felt that things weren't going right. And so for us to say put more money into it is, you know, sort of, you know, put more money into something that's not going right. So I think the equation really needs to be changed. I think if parents feel and if the taxpayer feels like what's happening in public education is a good thing, I think people do want to put more money into it. So we really have to have more we have to put more confidence basically into the system. We need to change things within the system so that taxpayers feel like, yes, my money is going to something good. I think, Ernie, that if you pay taxes and you feel like that child that the money is going towards is going to be successful, they're going to have the ability to possibly go to college, they're going to be taxpayers, you want that to happen. We want our kids to be successful, but we don't want to put money into a system that we think is unsuccessful.
I'd like to take a moment to talk about what Texas has done right in public education, because we look at these negative reports about failing schools and failing students. Texas guarantees in the Constitution a suitable and efficient education system for the general dissemination of knowledge, this being a desirable goal for the people of the state of Texas. And overall, we have done a great job in that. We have educated our children. The vast majority go off to be good, solid, productive contributors to Texas society. We educate everybody, regardless of handicaps and disabilities or backgrounds. We say you're welcome into our public schools, and we are going to educate you. And the vast majority of these children come out of schools with an education, maybe not a diploma, but with an education, and they contribute to society. We have been very, very successful on that.
But you can have a restaurant that feeds everyone that comes in there, but then we have to look at, well, is it being managed correctly? Even if you're still achieving feeding, you're still achieving educating students.
Please
that
don't
come
get
to
me
your
wrong.
doors.
Every day we need to get better at what we do.
Okay.
When I walk out of the classroom every day, I think about what I did today and how can I do it better tomorrow. Teachers reflect on their lessons every day, and if you are considered to be the most efficient and the most productive, you still need to do that every single day. There's nothing here saying that we don't want to improve and get better and get more efficient. But we need to look at the massive job that we are doing in this state, in this country overall. We offer education to everybody.
The teachers are definitely taking a beating in all of this.
We are.
Teachers are being looked at. First of all, there seems to be a general feeling out there in the public that we've lost sight of the good teachers and all we focus on are the bad, or the teachers that are in over their head, or whatever the terminology is for a teacher who's not successful these days. And we've lost sight of this. So teachers, we hear them saying, oh, we're being laid off, and you hear the other side saying, well, come on, teachers aren't doing it. They're basically babysitters. They're not doing their job. What is right and what is wrong and what's going on in our schools today?
No, it's how we measure success. You know, if we measure success only by our standardized test, it's easy to control, it's easy to do, and if a student's performance isn't up to whatever level we say it needs to be, well, we blame the teacher. All right? See, the teacher's a failure. It's not true. It's how we measure our success. The measuring stick means everything. If I gave you a yardstick and told you to go measure the depth of the ocean in 100 different places, you'd come back and tell me the ocean is 3 feet deep. It's not true, but it's what it says.
But a good measure for our schools is how many kids are graduating from high school. I mean, there are plenty of measures, but if you look at just that as a measurement, which a lot of people would not acknowledge, that's sort of a good measure. If you're graduating from high school, then you're probably successful. And that's where we really fall short. And within urban areas all across the state, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, only about half, maybe a little bit less than half of the kids are a little bit more than half are graduating, less than half are not graduating. That's, you know, when you have a 43 or 46 or 48% of the kids that are dropping out, that's a measure of failure, I think.
So what do you blame on that?
I think it's mismanagement within the system. I tell you that if we were to take, in the greater Houston area, the 54 superintendents of the school districts and we'd line them up, you'd only pick a few leaders out of that group. I mean, I think that there's a really lack of leadership in many areas.
But then aren't those the ones deciding where the cuts go to?
They are. Some of them are. And they're school boards. But I think also that those leaders have not been good at making sure that they're having the right talent. I think there are many teachers that within their 3-year probationary period are never told that they're not a good teacher and let go. You know, I think even the teachers' unions would agree that early on in a teacher's career is where you decide whether you should stay or go.
That's why the probationary period exists.
Exactly.
Alan, let me get
we're
down
not
to you,
doing a
because
good
we haven't
job.
heard from you.
I want to disagree on that. I mean, I think there's some truth in that, but number one, the figures generally more like 70% of kids are getting through. Now, it really depends how you count.
But if we're looking at urban areas and we're looking
if you
at
look
true
at
numbers,
well, and I'm looking
half.
at Austin. I work at as a an advocate in the schools. I was a teacher for a long time. I study Austin all the time. I'm with our toughest high schools every day doing reform work, and we're looking at 70% of our kids.
Are you attributing that as a good percentage or a bad percentage?
I'm saying given the population we work with, Texas is one of the poorest states. We're one of the richest states, but we also have the highest level of growth of child poverty in the country. Central Texas, where Austin is, 3 times the rest of the state. So we have kids flooding into our schools with so many issues that have not had the background they should have, and they show up for a year and then they move on. The family disappears. Those kind of issues, and we're working hard to capture those kids and keep them stable and provide those things. But for people to expect schools to be everything, to solve every problem of society, I think is unrealistic. And I can't imagine the teachers that I work with, 95% of them, I can't imagine them working any harder or taking any more pressure.
Let me jump in here and say, back to an earlier question, these cuts have been mandated. Money is being taken away, and we've got to figure out how to do it. How can independent school districts, how can superintendents, boards, whatever, do this in the most responsible manner from your 3 points of view? What should they be looking at and how do they do it? Because they really don't have a choice at this point. They've got to do it. We can fix problems later on, but what is the answer today?
They've laid off teachers.
But is that the right answer?
No, it's not the right answer.
I'm not asking what they did. What should they be doing in this situation?
I think an issue is in a lot of districts, at least, and it really depends where you are, but in a lot of districts, we were already lean. Mm-hmm. And they're in some tough, there really aren't good choices.
No, the choices are very, I mean, it's like a Sophie's choice, basically, with a lot of this stuff. And I think, unfortunately, what we say is not what the superintendents will necessarily do. But I think it's a matter of looking at those kids that are on the borderline and focusing your efforts there. I mean, making sure that more kids graduate, making sure that those kids that can be productive members of society, but we're sort of worried about them, focusing on those kids.
But isn't there a fear if you take then the attention off your
yes,
best
that's
performing
why it's a horrible
students?
choice.
Yeah, then they're not going to have.
We went through an issue in Houston just this year when they were talking about reorganizing our magnet schools, and maybe cutting back on transportation to magnet schools in order to take that savings and spread around the general population. And the most active, the most involved parents, the ones who get their children into magnet schools, rose up in righteous anger, and they backed the school board and the superintendent off that. Every parent wants a great education for their child. I'm not sure that every parent wants a great education for everybody's child. And that is something we have to look at. The active ones, the ones who will write letters and make speeches in front of the school boards, are going to be heard. And the ones who are not so active for any number of reasons are going to be the ones that are going to be sending their child to the school that's going to be underfunded.
And the magnet schools are the schools that have worked. I mean, so it's unfortunate when we say, high poverty kids are going to these magnet schools and they're tremendously successful. Mm-hmm. So to say that we're going to cut on those successful programs seems absurd, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to look at what's working, but you also can't leave anyone behind.
Okay, so coming in September or August, I'm not even sure of the schedule anymore, kids are going back to school. What will we see different this year after these cuts have been made? And do these cuts this year affect this current budget?
I'm going to have about 20 more kids this year than I had last year.
Bigger class sizes.
And I'm on August 22nd when they're sitting in front of me.
Fewer dropout prevention programs, fewer special programs, kindergarten, half a day instead of a full day, which is going to be a disaster for working parents who want to have their kid in full-day kindergarten. I think you're going to see all sorts of special programs that existed before that no longer exist. Everything sort of at the edges will have been cut.
I'll add to that there's a lot of programs that are non-educational that are also being cut right now. So, for example, CHIP, Children's Health Insurance, is going to take a big hit this year. And Texas already was at the bottom in the number of kids we insure. That really affects school attendance. And the kind of kids we're trying to keep in school, if they don't have those supports, we're going to see them out of school and eventually in that dropout pipeline, prison pipeline, the kind of things we're trying to stop.
Okay, let's look at this from a little different point of view, too. For parents, what can they be doing to help this transition for the children? What can they do at their end to make it a quality experience still for the children?
I think parents need to become even more involved in their schools.
And what does that mean?
And that means understanding what the teachers are, what's happening with the teachers, helping the teachers if possible, but also becoming advocates for their children. Because when everything is being cut, it's still going to be the squeaky wheel that's getting the grease. And if you're a parent, you want to demand the most for your child, the most that's possible.
I can hear teachers right now saying, oh, no, I'm going to have every parent.
But it's not about the teachers. It's about what's best for the kids. And as a parent, you want to do what's best for your kids.
And quite frankly, I've been teaching for 32 years now, and I welcome parent input. I've never been afraid of a parent coming to me and asking me what's going on, because I've always been able to explain what's going on. So what do you say?
What should a parent be asking? What should they be coming to you about? What information should you be sharing with a parent?
The parents I have are concerned with their child's lack of progress in their eyes. All right, and they say, what can I do to help my child succeed? I said, just make sure that your child every night has a place to study, a place to read, and is doing so. There's nothing you can do. I'm not assessing the parent. I'm assessing the child. I teach high school, and it's different from the younger kids. But you have to give your child the opportunity to succeed, encourage them to succeed, but also recognize that sometimes they're going to fail. A speech I give to parents every year in the beginning of the year is that your child has 168 hours every week. It's the great equalizer. I don't want to hear that I don't have enough time to do something. Yes, you do. You have 168 hours. Get together with your child and decide how they're going to use their 168 hours. And it's the decisions that they make on the use of their time that's going to determine their success. I get them 4 hours a week. It's 164 hours I don't have them that's going to determine their success in my course.
From a little different angle, what we're seeing, and this is, we've heard somebody said that this crisis equals opportunity. Well, I'll take that and say in a way it does, because what we're seeing is parents from some of the wealthier areas, for the first time, are really thinking about parents and children from the lower income areas, because they're seeing we're having schools closed on both sides of town, and we're in the same room. And so with Safe Texas Schools, we're getting a lot of people who are advocating for each other. And I think ultimately that's what we need. You need to be concerned about your child, but it also needs to extend to, really a concern for the whole state. I was in a meeting recently, and somebody said, how many people live in the same place where you went to school? And about 4 hands out of 250 went up. They said it's a state issue. It's
Robert,
an us issue.
I have like 3 seconds left. Last word.
The last word is that we need to care about education. It really is our future, and education is the way that our children are going to be successful. We need to do it.
Gentlemen, this went way too quickly. Thank you very much for coming in. And each week we invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org/Houston8. It's a new website. Here you can read about our guests, learn more about the topic, and even watch past episodes. Programming note, next week on Houston 8, a re-airing of our episode on immigration reform. How do we figure out and deal with this sensitive situation in our country? What ideas, policies, and practices are being considered? And that's next week on Houston 8. And that does it for us tonight. Until next time, I'm Ernie Manous. Thank you for joining us, and have a great week.